All right, let's jump into some Norse mythology. Today, we're diving deep into Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology. We've got a bunch of YouTube videos breaking down the book. Some love it, some not so much.
Yeah, it seems like there's some pretty strong opinions out there.
And we're going to figure out why, right? Like, what makes Gaiman's version stand out? Is it a good intro to Norse mythology for, someone who's totally new to it all?
Definitely. And I think what's really cool is that we're not just looking at the myths themselves. We're also going to see how Gaiman, as a writer, made choices that shaped how people experience these stories. We've got experts weighing in, folks on YouTube giving their take. Should be a good mix.
Exactly. So first off, let's be clear. Gaiman's book isn't trying to be a textbook or anything, right? We've got Dr. Jackson Crawford. He's a Norse mythology expert, and he's pretty upfront about Gaiman kind of playing around with the source material.
Yeah, Dr. Crawford's not pulling any punches.
Nope, not at all.
But I think he raises a super interesting point. Like, can you stay true to these old myths and still make them fun for people to read today?
Totally. And, Dr. Crawford brings up how Gaiman handles the Norse names. It's a bit all over the place.
Oh, yeah, like sometimes it's Odin, other times it's Owen, same with Freya and Freya.
Exactly. So why does that even matter?
Well, imagine you're just starting to learn about Norse mythology. You open Gaiman's book and you see all these different spellings. You might not even realize they're talking about the same gods. It's like confusing.
Right. It's like if someone kept switching between calling you Jim and James, kind of throws you off, doesn't it?
Totally. And that's kind of ironic because Gaiman's trying to make Norse mythology more accessible, but this could actually make it harder for people to get the basics.
Yeah, I get it. So it's like he's trying to find that sweet spot between what we're used to and the whole Norse vibe, but it might be making things muddy.
Makes sense.
But here's the thing. There are tons of YouTube reviewers who absolutely loved Gaiman's book, like Exlibris and Hugo Reads. They both gave it glowing reviews.
They did.
So what is it about Gaiman's writing that people like that connect with?
I think it comes down to how he makes these ancient myths feel fresh and exciting. Hugo Reads even talked about how fast they read through the book. Like, Gaiman's writing just flows. It pulls you in.
So it's not just the stories themselves, it's how he tells them, right?
Exactly. Remember, myths weren't originally written down. They were told out loud around a fire or something. Gaiman's style kind of brings back that feeling.
It's like he's inviting you to sit down and listen to him tell a story, just like those old storytellers did.
Exactly. But that conversational style does have some downsides, too.
Yeah.
Dr. Crawford points out that Gaiman gets pretty creative with the stories, like adding stuff that's not actually in the original sources.
Oh, yeah. He definitely goes all out. There are whole backstories for characters who barely get mentioned in the eddas.
It's like he's taking a bare-bones story and adding all this meat to it.
One example that jumps out is his take on Loki's kids, right? In the prose Edda, Loki giving birth to Sleipnir, that 8-legged horse, it's like one page. But Gaiman turns it into this massive 133-page story.
Wow, that's quite the expansion.
Yeah. Talk about a glow-up, right? But is he doing too much? Is it changing the myth too much?
That's where it gets interesting. Dr. Crawford acknowledges that Gaiman's creative, but worries that these added details might lead people away from what the myths were really about.
He really wasn't happy with how Gaiman described Angerboda, the giantess, Loki's partner.
Yeah, after Balder dies.
Right. Gaiman describes her as a ghost. And Dr. Crawford's like, where did that come from?
Apparently, there's nothing about that in the original stories.
So it seems like Gaiman's filling the gaps with his own ideas.
Maybe. Or relying on less accurate translations.
And that's kind of the theme, isn't it? Gaiman's version of Norse mythology is just that, his version.
It is, for sure.
So what about the giants? How does he portray them?
Oh, that's another spot where Gaiman leans into some common misconceptions, probably to make things more exciting.
Like how?
Well, he often shows the giants, or Jotnar in Old Norse, as being physically bigger than the gods, like almost monsters.
Which makes sense. We always picture giants as huge.
Right. And that image comes partly from how we translate things into English and how the Titans are shown in Greek mythology. But Dr. Crawford emphasizes that the word Jotnar doesn't actually mean they're giant-sized. In fact, a lot of the gods like Thor and Odin have Jotnar mothers, so the lines are kind of blurry.
It's not just a simple good guys versus bad guys situation.
Not at all, but I can see why Gaiman might play up those differences.
Makes for a more dramatic story, right?
Exactly, and it taps into those classic good versus evil themes that we all know.
But again, it's about balance. Is he sacrificing accuracy to make things entertaining?
Seems like we're seeing a pattern here.
And Dr. Crawford even talked about how Gaiman's work has influenced movies and TV. He even helped Ian McShane, who played Odin in American Gods, with his Old Norse pronunciation.
Oh, way, that's awesome.
It is, right? Shows how Gaiman's ideas have really become mainstream.
Makes you wonder if his book will inspire a whole bunch of new adaptations. What do you think? Are we ready for a Gaiman-style Norse mythology movie universe?
Haha. Maybe a Thor movie where Loki gives birth to Sleipnir in all its glory. Okay, maybe not that. But seriously, it's cool to think about how Gaiman's version might shape how these myths are told in the future.
Definitely. So before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's dig a little deeper into some of Dr. Crawford's critiques.
Yeah, he had some specific examples of where he thinks Gaiman goes a little overboard with the embellishments.
Let's hear them.
One that stands out is how Gaiman gives Sif, Thor's wife, a much bigger personality.
Oh, yeah. She's pretty quiet in the Eddas, right?
Totally. But Gaiman gives her lines, a sense of humor, even a bit of a temper.
Sounds like he's trying to make the characters more well-rounded, even if it means straying from the original stories a bit.
And speaking of straying, remember those extra lines he gave Heimdall?
Yeah, the Watchman of the Gods. He doesn't talk much in the original texts.
Nope. But Gaiman gives him a voice, maybe to make things more dramatic.
And get this, he even gives Baldur dialogue, even though Baldur never speaks in the Eddas.
Wow, that's a bold move.
It is.
I wonder why he did that. Maybe to make Baldur more relatable before, what happens to him.
Could be. It's like Gaiman saying, hey, even a god who's doomed has thoughts and feelings.
But Dr. Crawford wasn't a fan of these changes, felt like it was changing the characters too much.
So we're back to that balancing act. How do you stay true to the myths while making them interesting for modern readers?
It's a tough question. What do you think? Should storytellers stick to the original text, or is it okay to get creative?
That's a good one.
It's like walking a tightrope.
It is.
So let's take a break here and see what else Dr. Crawford has to say about Gaiman's approach to Norse mythology.
One thing that struck me about Dr. Crawford's analysis was how he talked about Gaiman's writing style. Like you said, the language feels kind of jumbled sometimes, like a mix of old and new voices.
Yeah, it's like Gaiman's trying to capture that epic feel of the myths while also making them relatable, for us today. Do you think he pulls it off?
Well, Dr. Crawford wasn't so sure. He pointed out how Gaiman uses these old-fashioned phrases that sound kind of weird next to more modern dialogue. He even gave an example where Freya, the goddess of love and beauty, she goes from using formal language like whom to saying, I hate you so much in the next sentence.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty big jump. It's like he's channeling Shakespeare one minute and then a teenager the next.
Yeah.
So what's up with that?
Dr. Crawford thought maybe Gaiman was trying to create this sense of timelessness, blending the ancient with the modern, but it doesn't always work. He also mentioned that Gaiman uses a lot of repetitive phrasing, almost like he's writing for, little kids.
You mean like when he describes a fly as the biggest, blackest fly you have ever seen?
Exactly.
Yeah, I can see how that could get old. But maybe he's doing it on purpose to create a certain rhythm or emphasis.
Could be. It's interesting to think about how Gaiman's background as a fantasy writer might be influencing his approach here. He's definitely not afraid to play with language to create vivid imagery and stuff.
Right, but it's not always smooth sailing, according to Dr. Crawford.
Yeah.
So it seems like Gaiman's style is a bit hit or miss.
Yeah, some parts are beautiful and evocative, others are a bit clunky.
But even with those criticisms, Dr. Crawford does give Gaiman credit for some things.
Oh yeah, for sure. He specifically liked the scene where Odin and his brothers are thinking about creating the universe. He thought that was a really cool addition, even though it's not from any specific myth.
And he also enjoyed Gaiman's humorous take on Loki giving birth to Sleipnir. Remember how we talked about Gaiman expanding that short story from the prose Edda?
Yeah, he really went all out with that one.
And Dr. Crawford appreciated the humor and creativity there.
He did.
So it's not like he hates the book, right?
No, not at all. He just wishes Gaiman had been more upfront about, adding his own spin on things.
Like more transparent about the creative liberties?
Exactly. That Dr. Crawford's main problem is that the book is just called Norse Mythology, which makes it sound like it's going to be more faithful to the original myths than it actually is.
Right. Maybe something like Norse Mythology. Neil Gaiman's remix would have been better.
Yeah, or Norse Mythology, the Gaiman cut.
But maybe that's the whole point. Gaiman's not trying to replace the original myths. He's offering his own interpretation. Like he's inviting us to see these familiar stories in a new way.
That's pretty cool, right? He's introducing these ancient myths to a whole new audience.
But there's always that risk of misunderstanding, right? Especially when you're trying to make complex stories easy to understand.
True. It's like that game of telephone. where the message changes a little bit each time it's passed on.
Exactly. And it makes you think about the responsibility storytellers have to both the original stories and the people listening.
They have to find that balance between staying true to the myths and making them engaging.
It's a tough job.
It is. So let's shift gears a bit. We've heard a lot from Dr. Crawford, the scholar. But what about the average person who picks up Gaiman's book? What are they looking for in a retelling of Norse mythology?
That's a good question. I guess it depends on the person, right?
Right, some people might want a faithful adaptation. Others might want something new and exciting. Ex Libris, the YouTuber we talked about, they mentioned feeling overwhelmed by all the pressure to read and review new books all the time. They found Gaiman's book to be a nice break from that.
So for some people, it's not about being accurate. It's about finding a story that speaks to them, something that offers escape or entertainment.
Totally. And Gaiman's really good at creating captivating stories.
He makes the fantastical feel real.
Yeah, he does.
But even with all that, it's important to remember that his version of the myths is just one interpretation.
Right, it's not meant to replace the original sources.
It's more like a starting point, a way to get interested. So even if it's not perfectly accurate, it can still be a good introduction to Norse mythology.
Definitely. And that's why it's so important to think critically about these retellings, to ask questions, to compare, to form our own opinions.
It's all the part of the journey, right?
Absolutely. And speaking of journeys, let's go back to those specific things Dr. Crawford pointed out.
Like how he didn't, like a Gaiman described Hel, the goddess of the underworld.
Oh, yeah, with half her flesh rotted black.
Right. He said that wasn't in the original myth, so why does that matter? Is it just a small detail or is it a bigger problem?
I think it goes back to that struggle between staying true to the source material and taking creative liberties. Maybe Gaiman wanted to make it more visually striking, or maybe he's drawing on later interpretations, or even just his imagination. But it shows that his version is his version.
It's not a direct translation, it's filtered through his own lens.
Exactly.
So readers should know that going in, they're getting Gaiman's take on the myths. But that doesn't mean it's not valid or interesting. It's just another layer of interpretation.
And that's what makes mythology so fascinating. It's always evolving, always being reinterpreted. Gaiman's book is just one part of that ongoing conversation.
And we're happy to be part of that conversation. We've covered a lot about Gaiman's Norse mythology and what people think about it. What are your thoughts so far? Are you on Gaiman's side or Dr. Crawford's side?
Or maybe somewhere in between.
It's interesting to think about, right?
It is. I think it's safe to say that Gaiman's book has definitely got people talking about the role of retellings and adaptations.
And those conversations are just going to keep going as more people discover these stories.
Especially with all the potential for new movies and shows based on Norse mythology.
Imagine a Gaiman-inspired Thor movie.
That would be something.
Of course, they'd have to figure out that balance between staying true to the myths and making a good movie.
But it's a challenge worth tackling. These stories are incredible. They deserve to be shared and appreciated.
And who knows, maybe Gaiman's book will inspire a whole new generation of storytellers.
Maybe.
But before we get lost in all that, let's just take a moment to appreciate the power of storytelling itself.
Yeah.
Whether it's ancient myths passed down through generations, academic studies, or modern retellings like Gaiman's, stories can transport us, challenge us, connect us to something bigger.
That's beautiful. It reminds us that these myths aren't just things of the past. They're alive. They still speak to us today.
And that's what makes this deep dive so rewarding. It's not just about one book. It's about the power of myths and how they shape how we see the world and ourselves. But before we wrap up, there are a few more things from Dr. Crawford's analysis that I think we should talk about.
Oh, okay. Let's hear them.
Get ready for some more insights into Gaiman's creative choices. Okay, so remember how we were talking about Gaiman really going all out with the story of Loki giving birth to Sleipnir?
Yeah, he really took that one and ran with it.
Well, Dr. Crawford pointed out something else interesting about that scene. In the original myth, Loki turns into a female horse, right?
Right, to distract that giant stallion.
And that's how Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse, is born. But Gaiman adds something.
He does.
He describes Loki actually nursing Sleipnir after the birth.
Oh, wow. So he's like a nurturing mother.
Yeah, it's a really interesting twist. In the original, it's all about the trickery and the magic. But Gaiman focuses on this unexpected motherly care.
It adds a whole other layer to Loki's character.
Right, it's like he's saying that even a trickster god can have a soft side.
Makes sense.
It's funny and a little weird, but it also makes you think about Loki differently.
It does.
He's not just a troublemaker. He's capable of compassion, maybe even love.
It's a much more complex portrayal than we usually see.
And it's not just Loki. Remember how Gaiman gives Sif more lines and personality?
Yeah.
Well, in one scene, she actually challenges Thor, questions what he's doing, stands up for herself.
Wow, that's totally different from the Edis.
It is, right.
She's just kind of there in the background of the original myths.
Exactly. So it's almost like Gaiman's giving these female characters more agency and more of a voice.
Interesting, especially considering how male-dominated Norse society was.
Do you think he's making a point about gender roles or power dynamics?
That's a tough one. I don't know if there's an easy answer.
It's definitely something to think about.
Maybe he's trying to change those traditional roles. Or maybe he just likes writing strong female characters.
It could be both.
What do you think? Do you see it as a feminist statement or just his style?
It's cool how something like adding dialogue can spark these kinds of conversations.
It is.
It's not just about the myths, it's about how we see them, how they reflect our own ideas.
And let's not forget how enjoyable it is to just listen to a good story.
Yeah.
Gaiman's Norse mythology, even with all the changes, it's a really engaging read.
It pulls you in, makes you feel like you're right there with the gods and giants.
He's a good writer. You have to give him that.
And that's what Hugo reads liked about it, remember? They said Gaiman makes the myths fun and easy to understand, even if you've never read the original texts.
That's important, right? These stories have so much to offer. It's great that more people are getting exposed to them.
Totally. So what's next for you? Maybe you'll check out Gaiman's book, or maybe you'll dive into the Eddas and sagas.
Ooh, that's a good idea.
Either way, this deep dive has hopefully given you a taste of Norse mythology and made you want to learn more.
And as you learn, keep asking questions, keep thinking critically, come to your own conclusions. These myths belong to all of us. Each generation finds something new in them.
Maybe you'll even be inspired to write your own version, to reimagine these ancient stories for today's world.
That would be amazing.
So that's it for our deep dive into Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology. We've gone through the ups and downs, the good and the bad, the accurate and the embellished. We've talked about why these stories matter and how they continue to resonate with us today.
And we've challenged you to think about them in new ways.
Exactly. So thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you enjoyed it.
It's been a pleasure.
And now, go forth and explore the myths.